Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're well. Today is Wednesday. It is the 14th of May, and we are getting ready for Parshas Emor. We're getting ready for Parshas Emor, and I'm looking forward to sharing something with you today that I think some of you might recognize a we're going to see a wonderful Yiddish expression. But before we get to that expression, we're going to first jump into the Parsha. So the Parsha Emor has a lot in it. Emor starts dealing with a lot of the laws that pertain to Kohanim and the Kohen Gadol, and then it moves on from there to many of the Yom Tovim. You'll recognize much of the Torah reading from the Torah reading that we read together on the various Yom Tovim, the Shalosh Regalim. So you'll see that there's a digest of all of the major festivals that take place in the course of the Jewish year. And at the end, there's this wild episode of the Mekalel, of the blasphemer that takes place. And there's just so much in this parsha. It just almost seems like each one deserves more attention than the next, but that's what we'll find. I want to focus this morning on, or this afternoon rather, on an item that appears in the Parsha that doesn't always get enough attention. It says as follows, we're in chapter 21, that's Perek Aleph. It's telling us about the Kohanim, but this law does apply to the rest of Klal Yisrael as well. It tells us that what do they, upon suffering the loss of a loved one, it tells us, Lo yirkarchu karcha b'rosham, they shall not make bald patches on their head. In other words, as a demonstration of their mourning, they shouldn't just, rip out a chunk of hair or shave off a chunk of hair. Ufasa kanam lo yigalechu, and they shouldn't, destroy their beards as a sign of mourning. Ubiv saram lo yisratu sarates, and in their flesh they should not make cuts as well. Some of the commentaries say that the ancient minhag that we have of kriya, that when someone suffers the loss of a loved one, to tear a garment, was actually hopeful to prevent this. There's a natural reaction that people have to express their pain, to express their anger sometimes, but that sense of loss, and it could lead to self-harm. You see here that again, that we're told three things not to do: shaving off or ripping out some of the hair in the head, some of the beard, or cutting oneself. That's self-harm, that's self-mutilation. So I've seen some explain the custom of kriya, of tearing a garment, doing something that's an act of destruction, which seems to violate Baltashkas, that we don't want to destroy items that are perfectly usable. Some is this to give the mourner a chance to vent and to let off some steam, almost loosen the valve there, just to allow that steam to be let off in a fashion that won't hurt him or herself. I've actually seen some people explain the custom that way. But be that as it may, this is a prohibition that applies to everyone, not just Kohanim. I was thinking about this several years ago. I saw a film of a Navy SEAL who had been killed in duty, and his comrades had come to mourn his loss. They were burying him. So he had this beautiful wooden casket. It was polished, and they did two things at this that I thought were very interesting. This must be a minhag that they have within the Navy SEAL community. That's the special forces within the Navy. Uh, they all have a trident. That's like this. It's like of an eagle with that trident behind it. That's a special pin that they wear on their uniform. So again, on their combat fatigues, it might just be a patch, but on their dress uniform, there are two pins that go through the uniform, and then it has backings on it. So what they all did at this funeral was they took out the trident, they laid it on top of the casket, a wooden casket, and gave a stomp with the hand to like basically nail it into the casket. They were sending off their friend, this brother in arms, and by the time he's done, all the Navy SEALs were there at the funeral. So there was a number of tridents that had been pounded into the top of the casket. That was one thing I saw, and I saw okay that there's this brotherhood, that brother in arms, band of brothers kind of idea. But then I saw something that I'd never seen before, and it just made me come back to this. I saw a number of these guys again while they're in the Navy. They have all sorts of regulations about how long they could grow their hair. Unless they were, in, let's say, working undercover, then I would guess that they could grow their hair a little longer. But some of these guys were probably veterans and they had already left the Navy, so some of them had longer hair. I saw several of them go like this. They took like a strand of hair, just rip it out, and they threw it in the open grave. And I looked it up, and this goes back to some kind of Norse mythology, like something with the Vikings, or some kind of, but it's basically some kind of pagan mythology about that was the way that they expressed their mourning was by ripping out a chunk of hair and throwing it in the grave like that. And it brought me immediately back to this pasuk because this pasuk says it again. What is the Jewish practice in mourning? Lo yikarchu karcha b'rosham. They should not make bald patches on their heads. Upasikanam lo yigalechu. Don't rip out beard hair. And then also b'saram lo yisratu sarates. Don't cut oneself in their flesh. In other words, these must have all been practices that were prevalent in the pagan world about how to express that anguish and that mourning about the loss of a loved one. And just again, seeing that at the funeral, and again, when I looked it up, I thought it was like some old Viking warrior tradition. So that's probably, Vikings were seafaring warriors. So that's probably how this made it into this Navy SEAL or some of the Navy ethos. But again, I'd never seen this before, and it just brought me back to this pasuk. And again, the Vikings were pagan; they were not a Christian people. They were pagan. So this could have been some ancient pagan ritual. And again, it's just brought me back to this pasuk just when I saw that. The pasuk goes on. Look at the next pasuk. After it tells us not to do that, it says Kedoshim yu lelo kechem lelo kayem. It says, but you are supposed to be sanctified to your God. Lo yichalu shem Elokeim, and you should never do anything that desecrates the name of God. Ki es ishe Hashem lechem Elokeim ehem akrivim v'yokedesh, because they bring up the fire offerings of the Lord, food offerings of God, so holy. So this pasuk seems to be adding, while this may be true for all of Am Yisrael, why all the Jewish people should not do anything that could be of self-harm or to make their appearance look terrible upon the loss of a loved one. And we said that some use this to explain the minhag of kriya, to give the mourner a chance to vent and give voice to that anger or anguish that they feel, something that won't produce any self-harm. So there's that idea. But the next pasuk seems to say, why is it specifically that Kohanim should not do this? So a plain reading of the pasuk says, because Kohanim are supposed to be, there are communal representatives. They're like our shaliach tzibor. They're our agents. They're the ones who are operating in the first in the Mishkan and later in the Beis Hamikdash. They're the ones representing us and bringing our korbanos. We need them to be looking sharp and put together, not doing anything that could inflict self-damage and making them look off-putting for them, especially. While this may be true for all of Am Yisrael, it's especially true for them. That's the plain reading of those psukim. And then this year, I want to share with you, I saw something in the Maharil Diskin. Rav Yeshua Leib Diskin, he was a storied leader in 19th century Eastern Europe. The town that he was most associated was with Brisk, because that was the town he lived in before making Aliyah. He moved to Israel at the end of the 1800s and was a Rav of Yerushalayim. So he's known as the Maharil Diskin as an acronym. His name was Rabbi Yeshua Leib. Rabbi Yeshua Leib Diskin. If anyone's ever heard of in Israel, you might still get mailings from them. The Diskin Orphanage. So I believe that was he and his wife, one of their chesed projects that they began upon moving to Israel. Again, there was no safety net in place. It wasn't like there was a state that was there to provide for an orphanage. There was a ton of orphans. Before modern medicine, people were dying and then kids would be left. Who was going to take care of them? So him and his wife, they started this Diskin orphanage. To this day, I once did some research into this. I don't think it's running as a full-fledged orphanage about kids who lost their parents, but there are a lot of kids from either underprivileged or disadvantaged homes that they're taking in. Like it's like a youth village, like that's
I was going to say it's like a school with
exactly looking after them because their needs aren't being met at home.
Yeah.
So it'll have living quarters, it'll have full nutritious meals and schooling and stuff of that, and make sure all their health care is taken. So it's not in that classic orphanage that we think of, but it's definitely taking care of kids who definitely need help, and their families weren't able to provide. So I want to share with you something beautiful he writes on this pasuk. He says, look at the way he reads these two psukim, and he links them to one another. He says, Lo yikarchu karcha b'rosham. He says the Torah, specifically speaking to the Kohanim, says they're not supposed to rip out any hair of their heads or their beard as a sign of mourning. They shouldn't cut themselves. And then the next pasuk, it's a juxtaposition. The next pasuk is Kedoshim yu. You need to be sanctified. So look what he says. Kach hamshech hapasuk. This is the continuation, the juxtaposition of these verses. The pshutaso, the Kyle Kohanim, in its plain sense, in other words, even though we extrapolate this for all of Am Yisrael, the plain reading of the pasuk is God speaking to Kohanim. V'amar akasav kain, and here's what the Torah is saying. Dihine, it's painting a contrast. Komrim shalahem, the priests of the pagan world, let's say those in the idolatrous world, their priests, osim lahem kain. You know what? This is the stuff that they would do. Their priests in the pagan world, in the world of idolatry, they would do stuff to express anguish of a loss. They would rip out hair. They would rip out a beard. They would cut themselves. Shinuyim barosham. They had to do something to distinguish themselves, to make them look different. That if someone was to see them, they'd know their ranking on the totem pole in their societies. Oh, that must be a priest because look, he's got chunks of hair missing from his head. Ubiv saram, or he's got cuts on his arms. That's what their priests did. They needed to do this as a way to identify themselves in ancient societies. How did you know who the priests were? Well, look at the ones who've got chunks of hair ripped out of their heads, who've got ripped out of their beards, and would cut themselves. Those were the priests. Without that, you wouldn't be able to clearly identify who were the priests. Because they did all the same disgusting, degenerate behavior as their flock. There was nothing that distinguished them from their flock. They were involved in all the perverse actions of their flock. The only way that you could tell apart who were their priests, look were the ones who had chunks of hair missing, the ones who had chunks of beard missing, the ones who had cuts on their arms and bodies. Avalatem, but the pasuk is saying, you're not like that, Am Yisrael. You, HaKohanim, you, my priests, the Kohanim of Am Yisrael, Einatem tzrichim lasos kain. You don't need to do this. You don't need to identify yourself by having chunks of hair ripped out, chunks of beard ripped out, and cuts on your bodies. Because I have admonished you, I have asked you to live a life of sanctity, of holiness. You need karim, and everyone should recognize you that you're the priest. Mikoch maaseh matovim, because your actions are so distinguishable. Everyone sees, look at the midos, look at the character. That must be a Kohen. Who else behaves themselves, conducts themselves in such a great way? Came Zera Berach Hashem. They are the offspring of those who bless, who have been blessed by God and also bless the people in God's name. Kamasha Kasav, Veru Kol Amei Haaretz Kishem Hashem Nikra Elecha V'Yirumimcha. All the nations of the world will see you, that the name of God has been called on you, and they'll be scared of you. Al Kain. That's therefore you don't need to do this. Other nations of the world, their priests might need to do these things to distinguish them, so everyone will know. We're all in the pub. How do we know who the priest is? Everyone's the same drunken mess and acting as degenerate as each other. How do I know who the priest is? Oh, that must be him. He's missing chunks of hair from his head, from his beard, and he's all cut up. Oh, that's the priest. In Am Yisrael, that's not necessary because the priests they've been asked to live a life of sanctity. They've been asked to live a life of refinedness, where their actions make them identifiable. So they don't need to do this stuff. It's beneath you. That's how Mariel Diskin is reading this. I thought that's fascinating. Now look at the psukim. Now you see the linkage. The first pasuk says, "Don't do this." Why not? That's the next pasuk. You know why it's not necessary? Because Kedoshim Elokayim. I've already asked you to be a sanctified group, and everyone will know to tell you apart based on your conduct. So you don't need to do this. You don't need these external manifestations. That's not necessary for you. What a beautiful way to read those psukim. Now let's see someone who takes it a step further. So I saw that Rabbi Matis Bloom of blessed memory in his Talmud. This is not Rabbi Matis Bloom. This is Rav Moshe Sternbach. Rav Moshe Sternbach he's still with us. God bless him. I got confused with Rav Matis Bloom because on Shabbos I'm going to be sharing an afternoon class, something I saw from Rav Matis Bloom. So I'm sorry I got them because this is Tam Vadas. This is Rav Moshe Sternbach who's God bless him. He's aging, but he's in Yerushalayim. So he quotes this Mariel Diskin, but then he adds something to it. So we're not going to have to read the whole thing because he starts off by quoting him. Let's look where I have the finger. You see, I have the finger pointing. He says, Vayakirum. He says, actually, go a line above that. In other words, what the pasuk is saying, it's not necessary for you to rip out your head hair, not necessary for you to rip out your beard hair. Why? Because everyone knows who you are. Through your actions and through your righteousness, everyone already exalts you, everyone elevates you because everyone sees these are refined people. So they hold them above. V'yakirum, and they're recognizable by kol ro'eim b'kedushasam. Everyone in the community who sees them immediately knows. Again, in the Beis Hamikdash, they're wearing special clothing, but outside the Beis Hamikdash, when they're wearing clothing just like you and I, how do we know they're the Kohanim? Because of look at their mitos, how refined they are. They don't need to start ripping out their hair. V'yisr tu b'saram, or cutting their flesh. Now look what he has. This is what Rav Sternbach adds. V'chein hu lidoros, and this is the way it is throughout all generations. Be Yisrael, amongst the Jewish people, not just Kohanim, but this has spread throughout the entirety of Judaism. Shetzadikeim, the righteous ones of the Jewish people. V'chasideim, the pious ones of the Jewish people. Nikarim b'maaseim. The way we recognize them is not by their different outfits, but by their deeds. Uvekol orach chayim, and by the way they live their lives. The way we spot who are our holy people, it's not by any kind of different outfits. It's the way that they live. Ukedushasam machrezes aleim, and their level of sanctity, their refined character, how they live their lives, it's like it's screaming out and it's announcing. Birosh chutzos, in all of the courtyards, ad she'enam tzrichim l'shum simanei heker chitzonim lo'odiyam alasam. They do not need any external way to remind anyone who they are. We know who our righteous individuals are, not by any kind of identifying feature on their bodies, not by any kind of featured clothing, but rather through their actions. Now, when I saw this, I said, wow, this reminds me of a Yiddish expression. Let's see what it was. So I looked it up online. Here's the way I see this, that Rav Herschel Schachter of Yeshiva University and of the OU, here's the way he says this. And I saw something that he had out there. Today, the term frum is usually used with a positive connotation. Like we want to say someone's very pious, someone's very observant. However, he says in pre-World War II Lita in Lithuania, it was usually used as a negative description of one who publicly displays his piety. In other words, again, this was a different hashkafa in the Hasidic world, but in the Litvish world, in the Lithuanian world, they were not into public displays of piety at all. Some of the Balei Musar used to say, this was the expression in Yiddish, he says here, a galach, that's Yiddish for a priest, a galach has to be from. That a priest, they need something external to identify, so everyone knows who the priest is. A Yid has to be ehrlich, a Yid has to be honest, and that's how we know who a Yid is. And then basically, the Yiddish expression would be, a galach is from, or from is a galach, a Yid is ehrlich. That was the contrast, and that was something that what Rav Schachter was quoting. And I heard that I put down here, I remember hearing in yeshiva on many occasions, I think it was slightly different. What I remember, again, I could be mistaken. I remember my Rosh Yeshiva, there's a picture of Rabbi Leibowitz, Rabbi Henoch Leibowitz. He was coming from Lithuanian stock, and he always prided himself on running his yeshiva according to the Musar traditions that he got from his father, who was a student of Slobodka and Radin, the Chafetz Chaim, and Slobodka was the altar of Slobodka, Rav Nosson Tzvi. And I remember him telling us that his father would often say, a galach is from. I thought I remember him saying, instead of a yid is erlich, I think I remember him saying a yid is edel. Edel means like refined. Like erlich means honest, Edel, I think that's the way I remember him saying this, that a yid is edel, a yid is refined. In other words, it was never something that was back in Lita that there was outward forms of piety. That was something that was almost denigrated. That's for the galach. The galach does that. A yid works on being edel. You should be a refined person. And that's what Mariel Diskin is saying here. That's how the Mariel Diskin is reading it. That's how Rav Sternbach is applying this for all generations, not just the Kohen, is that it shouldn't be about any kind of external features. It should be the way we behave, the way we conduct ourselves. People should know that we're refined. That's what we're working on. I remember, again, I didn't put this here, but I remember, again, that Rabbi Leibowitz would say over from his father that his tradition he had from Slobodka was even almost to take it a step further. It wasn't just that they looked down on external forms of piety, but they almost felt it would be counterproductive at a developmental age of someone, meaning especially when someone was a student in yeshiva, is that if all I need to do is buy a certain outfit and put it on, what work is there to be done? In other words, if I could say, wow, I'm observant because look at this, I bought this certain outfit, then I don't need to work on myself anymore. To the contrary, don't get into any of these external trappings, because then what we'll have to focus on is refining ourselves, making sure that I'm really a good Eved Hashem. I'm doing what I need to be doing. I'm filling all my responsibilities as a good Jew, and I'm working on my character. So in order to, it would be almost counterproductive to get caught up on these outward manifestations.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that bothers me sometimes when an Orthodox Jew goes to court.
Yeah.
And he dresses from the black hat
Yeah.
all the way down.
Yeah.
To me,
It's bad. I'm told a friend of mine who was a grandson of Rav Schwab from Washington Heights used to say, like, he wishes these people would just take off their yarmulkes when they go in, because it's a Chillul Hashem. And they're obviously, what they're trying to do is the same way every thug, when they're ended up in court, they always come in with a Bible because they want to show I'm a changed person. I found God, and hoping the judge will have mercy. That's just another form of that. They're trying to say if I'm, but what it does is it casts a horrible expression. Right. But this is almost a different angle. He was saying, like, at the developmental stage. Like, for example, I remember this when I was in yeshiva. I remember times where, let's say a kid was, I don't know, 18, 19 years old and decided he was growing some facial hair, wanted to grow a beard. I remember Rabbi going over and saying, like, what are you doing? Like, can you just explain that to me? And if the kid said, like, hey, I'm just trying to have a fun time, like, Lag Bomer's coming and I want to have a goatee. So in order to have that, I got to do, that's one thing. But if the kid was saying, like, like, I want to look a certain part, I remember them, asking, God, that's not our Masorah. They would say, that's not our tradition. If a kid, let's say, was not coming from a Hasidic family and decided he wanted,
Rabbi,
yeah, hang on a second. If a kid was coming from a Hasidic family and wanted to grow payas, and that wasn't their family's tradition, I remember Rabbi coming over and saying, like, look, we need to talk about this. If this isn't your family tradition, like, let's just make sure. Are you still working on yourself? Is the reason you're doing? What's the reason behind this? And lastly, I'll say here, and again, a lot of this world has been lost. Again, like the Lithuanian Torah world was decimated in the Holocaust. The Nazis destroyed it, and as well as much of the emphasis on the Musar yeshivas. So this is lost, but this is something to be aware of. I'll just end with one more thing, and then I'll call on you. Is that I remember Rabbi Leibowitz telling us that he remembers when he was a kid, he was a teenager, and somehow his parents had, given him money to buy himself a new suit. I don't know if it was for Yom Tov or whatever, and he had come back from the tailor with a black suit. And his father looked at him and said, "What are you doing?" So he says, I got a nice suit. He had him go back and get a different color. Had him go back and get, I think, a gray or something like that. And he said it was from this same idea. I don't want you thinking, I don't want you, wearing a costume of someone. Like, I want you got to work on yourself. You got to, again, this is lost today, but this is where this is that expression was coming from. A Galach is from, a Yid is Adel. In other words, that's where that would come from. All right, before we go on, I think there was a question online. Was there
oh,
something?
yeah, I was going to say over 20 years ago, I think somebody was suing me over a bill or something. And when I went in, the prosecuting attorney recognized that I was Jewish, and he told the judge, I can't handle this case because she's Jewish. So I guess some people might want to be Jewish because it'll throw them into another prosecuting
I don't
group
know.
or
I
person.
I, I don't
So
know.
that's interesting that,
I don't
because
know.
they
I
can't
just wish
testify.
that when some of these scoundrels get themselves caught, I wish the last thing they would do would portray themselves as being Jewish. It reflects poorly upon us. Rabbi Wein has a famous expression, like, begs us, like, please don't confuse Jews with Judaism. There's a lot of Jews out there who behave badly, and God willing, that should never alter our image of it. But anyhow, this idea about a
I
Galach
just
is
thought that
from
was interesting.
and a Yid is Adel. I want to share with you again, and we saw here that Rav Shechter was saying. So I remember hearing this from Rabbi Leibowitz all the time. This was such a constant emphasis was put on this in the pre-World War II, pre-Holocaust Lithuanian yeshiva world. I want to share with you someone that I stumbled upon a couple of years ago that is an incredible manifestation of this, and it's no wonder, because you'll soon see as we study a little bit about him. Again, his neshama should have an aliyah. This is someone that I don't think any of us have ever heard of before. One of his daughters got in touch with me, but let me first tell you how I chanced upon him. What we're going to see here is about 3 pages about a rabbi I don't think anyone here has heard of before, Rabbi David Winchester. Rabbi David Winchester. Probably not too many Jews you've ever met with the last name of Winchester. I have no idea how he got that last name, if that's something his ancestors got upon coming to Ellis Island. What? So let me tell you, I once mentioned him, and let me tell you how I mentioned him, is that when I was going several years ago, when I was going through all the letters of Dave Shainberg, who was killed in Hebron, towards the end of his year that he spent there, he's talking about this wonderful young fellow who has just arrived from Chicago, didn't name him, and he says this fellow gave up a pulpit in Springfield, Illinois, because he wanted to go back to yeshiva and just totally immerse himself in his Torah learning, and he was part of the Chevra, that group of Americans who were in the Chevra yeshiva. And now I had to do some research. Part of that was, again, I want to do some detective work. Who was this person? So I started doing some homework, and I was able to figure out. I cracked the case. It was Rabbi David Winchester. So that's how I spoke of him. He survived the Hebron massacre. We're going to see a little bit more about him, but that's a picture of him. What you'll notice about Rabbi David Winchester is that picture was taken of him at the end of his life. And he basically wanted to go his entire life incognito. Didn't want to look anything different than the average Jew on the street. This is again someone who was living this principle of a Galach is from, a Yid is Adel. And you'll see where he got this from. This obviously he spent a good formative number of his years, first being educated in Chicago by teachers who had come from the Lithuanian tradition, and then he was in Hebron. That was Slobodka's branch in Israel. So it makes sense where he got this from. But just to do him justice, we have to read this together. I don't think anyone here has ever heard of him, and you have to see what kind of a tzaddik this man was. This is incredible. So he passed away in 1974. He has a daughter. The daughter's name, I believe, is Rosalind Kaganoff. And after I put out the article and I mentioned him in the footnote, she reached out to me. This is a daughter. She lives in Israel. And when I was visiting my parents once in Netanya, I don't know how she got a hold of my phone number. She tracked me down. She wanted to tell me more about her father. This man was a tzaddik. I mean, unbelievable. So let's just read this together. So this is Rabbi David Winchester. You see, he passed away in 1974. So that would have been 50 years ago. Having been stabbed 13 times and left for dead, which again, I don't understand how he survived this before antibiotics. How on earth could someone have been stabbed in Hebron, which was not a clean place, 13 times, left dead, and he survived? The young Rabbi David Winchester would later consider himself very fortunate as he lay bleeding in the streets of the holy city of Hebron on Shabbos, August 24th, 1929. He opened one eye just wide enough to notice Arab boys circulating among the other victims. Kicking the bodies and listening for groans, they took it upon themselves to call over the adults to attend whoever needed to be finished off. Thankfully, Rabbi Winchester was not noticed by the boys or men, and when the Chevra Kadisha came the next day to care for and bury the victims, a doctor realized Rabbi Winchester was still alive. All told, some 67 Jewish men, women, and children were brutally slaughtered in the Hebron massacre, and the city's millennial-old Jewish community was simply erased overnight. Having escaped with his life, Rabbi Winchester returned to Chicago, where he spent 18 months recovering in a hospital. After surviving the harrowing atrocities, Rabbi Winchester saw himself as spared by divine providence. He had a sense that he carried a deep personal responsibility to live a life of kindness and to dedicate himself to chesed. During his time as a teacher at the Hebrew Theological College, HCC, that's again, which eventually moves to Skokie, Illinois. But again, at first it wasn't there. And as the rabbi of Nusach Hari Synagogue in the Albany Park neighborhood, he became a veritable one-man charitable organization, having an untold trail of personal heroism and leaving an untold trail of personal heroism in his wake. As a small child, Rabbi Winchester came with his parents from Stadtau, Poland to Chicago. Although his family was not rigorously observant, his sincere approach to Torah and Judaism led him into the world of learning. He began learning at HTC, where he stayed until he completed Yoredeya and Yad Smicha. So that's an advanced Smicha in 1927. At that time, he became the first rabbi of Congregation B'nai Abraham in Springfield, Illinois. Within a short time, he decided on a radical change, taking the rare step to leave America to learn Torah in Eretz Yisrael. He was one of only two handfuls of North Americans in the yeshiva in Hebron, which had only recently relocated from Slobodka in 1925 and had yet boasted some 265 students by 1929. Even before that fateful pogrom, Rabbi Winchester demonstrated extreme dedication to those in need. At one point, two students in the yeshiva fell ill with typhoid, a fatal and highly contagious disease. The students, we're on next page. The students, that's a picture of him recovering in the hospital after the Hebron massacre. The students were promptly quarantined. In time, they were so weak they couldn't even leave their quarters to retrieve their regular meals. Despite the personal danger involved, the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Moshe Mordechai Epstein, decided that he must visit with them. When he came to their room, he was shocked to discover Rabbi Winchester standing there feeding the students, selflessly risking exposure so that he could care for them. From that time on, Rabbi Epstein would deferentially rise for his student, Rabbi Winchester, whenever Rabbi Winchester would come into a room. Having recovered from his injuries in Hebron circa 1937, Rabbi Winchester married Charlotte Weiss. So again, that's years after the massacre was 29. So this is almost 8 years later. So this is a man at this point, again, if he was born in, what did we say? He was born in 1903. So again, he's a good in 30s, he's in his 30s. He's 34 years old at this point. Rabbi Winchester married Charlotte Weiss, whose father, Rabbi Mordechai Weiss, was the rabbi of the modest Nusach Hari synagogue in Albany Park, neighborhood of Chicago. Shortly after the wedding, Rabbi Winchester became the rabbi of the Beth Tfilah Moses Synagogue in Mount Clemens, Michigan. I don't know if you're familiar, Mount Clemens was very famous in the 1950s for a very famous case of where the congregation decided to go traditional and remove the mechitza. And there's a book. There was a man by the name of Baruch Litvin who fought tooth and nail, and it ended up going to federal court about whether a shul that had been founded as a traditional shul had the right to do away with its mechitza. This became a landmark case that gave materials to shuls all over the country that were dealing with this, because the outcome was he won. Baruch Litvin won. However, I think eventually they overpowered him. In other words, I think they dissolved that original congregation and just reopened under a different name and different assets, whatever, and the shul ceased to be. But in other words, he didn't maintain an Orthodox synagogue in Mount Clemens, but I believe he did win. But what he did do is he assembled a book. I have it at home. I'm trying to remember what is the name of that book now. Oy vey, it's on the tip of my tongue. But he assembled all of his materials that he used, and there were shuls around the country that were basically able to use that. Anyhow, so he had served there before Springfield. So this is a place where he had served. Rabbi Winchester returned to Chicago circa 1940. When his father-in-law passed away in approximately 45, Rabbi Winchester became the rabbi of Nusach Hari. In the same period, he also began to teach Gemara at his alma mater, HTC. Over the years, he would teach for the yeshiva on 3 different campuses: the original West Side campus, satellite Albany Park affiliated yeshiva, which he founded and led, and ultimately the Skokie campus, where the yeshiva is located today. As the community would soon learn, Rabbi Winchester used these rabbinic roles as a launching pad for acts of generosity and deeds of compassion that knew no bounds. In that class picture, he's the one in the middle there. That's taken in, I believe, 1927. Yeah, 27. That was when he got his smicha from Skokie Yeshiva there. Clean-shaven, soft-spoken, self-effacing, and supremely humble, Rabbi Winchester put the needs of others first and denied himself any rights of privilege or airs of superiority. He let others get ahead of him in line and would let others board crowded buses ahead of him, such that he could end up waiting through a number of buses at one time. He was known to go about on a frigid winter Chicago street without a coat, because he would give his own away to someone else who needed one. Upon the occasion of his son's wedding, friends bought him a coat, and he gave it away on his way to the wedding. He frequently enjoined the homeless, Jews and Gentiles, healthy and addicts, to sleep in the synagogue or even his own home, whose front door was routinely left unlocked. Of course, while it's almost always true that a rabbi's achievements reflect the dedication and support of his wife, it seems that Rebbetzin Charlotte Winchester's efforts were absolutely indispensable to her husband's heroism. She managed the family's meager means, supported his extreme gifts of time and money, and housed and fed the poor, stride for stride with her husband. This is to say nothing of her personal involvement with various mikvaot in Chicago over many decades. In any case, so boundless was Rabbi Winchester's penchant for giving, this is wild, that his employers knew to forward his wages directly to his wife so that the family's immediate needs could be met. In other words, they knew if they gave him money, he was going to give it all away. So they gave his paycheck to his wife. If they were to deliver the payment to Rabbi Winchester, they knew it would very likely be given away wholesale to the needy. In an extreme instance, the rabbi even prepared stationery with another's name listed as the rabbi of his shul. Years later, his son, Avi, learned that Rabbi Winchester had ostensibly given away his job to help an immigrant who feared he would be deported if he could not demonstrate that he had found employment. All in all, A lack of his own means never stood in the way of helping others. Although he had no car of his own, Rabbi Winchester maintained a weekly late-night appointment with someone who would drive him around town so that he could deliver parcels of meat to poor families. The families did not know who was bringing the food, and because Rabbi Winchester insisted on parking at some distance, the driver never knew who was receiving these packages. On one occasion, a dying and needy hospital patient was distraught that Rabbi Winchester was likely to spend his own money to cover his funeral expenses. To calm the patient, Rabbi Winchester brought a benefactor, Paul Rosenberg, to the hospital to assure him that he would cover the costs instead of the rabbi. In fact, Rabbi Winchester built up a considerable debt from various donors so he could have the means to support the poor. Fittingly, when his family and friends secured sponsorship to repay these loans upon Rabbi Winchester's passing, the creditors never came forward to collect. Rabbi Winchester this blew my mind here. Okay, so you see this man, this clean-shaven Litvak. Look at his next paragraph. Rabbi Winchester was exceptionally close to Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, Rebbe of Satmar. The Rebbe stated publicly at the time of his passing that Rabbi Winchester was a tzaddik nistar and one of the 36 hidden tzaddikim. While his piety was legendary and extended to everyone, regardless of the religious level, he himself was deeply religious. He was well versed in all revealed areas of Torah, maintaining correspondence with many Torah sages. He was also an expert in Nistar. That means like Kabbalistic stuff. So in other words, here's this clean-shaven Litvak. This is unbelievable. He appeared as a simple Yid, never growing a beard nor any other outward expressions of Yiddishkeit. Rabbi Winchester ultimately defined himself through his relationship with the weak and the downtrodden. This is the expression. A galach is from a yid is edel. This man is the epitome of this. This is unbelievable. Many rabbis built institutions and published scholarly books, won awards and honors, or otherwise found fame and renown. Through his undying devotion to those who most needed it, Rabbi Winchester pursued a decidedly different course. Rabbi Winchester was unquestionably fortunate to survive in Hebron in 1929. Indeed, it was fortunate for all of Chicago. That's what a person. I don't think until I started going through Dave Schoenberg's letters, I had never heard of him. And that's what he wanted to leave this world without being noticed. He wanted to fly under the radar screen. And if it wasn't for the fact that I had found him in allusions to him in Dave's letters, I wouldn't have ever heard of him. Where did I find this? A number of years ago, there was someone at the CRC in Chicago, Rabbi Moshe Kushner. He was a Moel in Chicago, and I believe he worked as the executive director at the CRC. And he had this passion of trying to find out who were all the Chicago Rabbanim. It was over a certain number of years. It wasn't over all years. It was, I've got it here, from 1847 to 1950. There were some very famous personalities and not so famous personalities who made a major impact on people's lives. So he started researching them, and every couple weeks, he would put out another article on one of these rabbis. And after Rabbi Kushner passed away, they published this book. So you can, on the CRC website, they have this book. I have it at home. It's absolutely fascinating, and you find names in there. I didn't even realize that rabbi was in Chicago at one point, and during that time period and something. So he did the homework and he found out about Rabbi Winchester. As I said, he has a surviving daughter that I'm aware of. There could be more kids because they mentioned in this article a son named Avi, but I know there's this daughter, Rosalind Kaganoff, who's in Israel, and I have no idea how large the family is. But he's Zichro Baruch. His memory his memory should be a blessing. But I couldn't help but think of him as I saw this idea in the Maharil Diskin, how he's learning these psukim about the Kohanim, that there's no need for them to do anything to tear out their hair and their beards and to cut themselves, because they'll be distinguishable based on their conduct. They'll be so refined. That's the job of a Kohen. And then Rabbi Sternbach applied that not just the Kohanim, but that's the job of the Jew. We have to work on ourselves. We have to be refined as possible. And that's our mission. And he says that's the way it remains to be. And then that brought to mind that expression about how a galach is from a yid is edel. We want to all work on being refined. That's our ultimate goal. We want to be refined, be the best Jew we can be, and don't get caught up on the externals. We want to be the best Jew that we can be. Obviously, there's different traditions on how to take this. I'm not in any way looking to denigrate the Hasidic approach. That was they had a different ideas on putting some importance on some of these external trappings, but just to recognize that within another very serious approach to Avodas Hashem had a very different idea that, especially during those formidable years when a student was learning, growing, and developing, and trying to make themselves into the best Jew that they can be, focusing in on that expression, a galach is from a yid is edel, and we have to all ask ourselves, what are we doing to refine ourselves? That's our job, to make ourselves into the best Jew that we can be, the best Eved Hashem, best servant of God that we can be, and really having the most sterling midos that we can be, and ask ourselves, would we be able to be picked out in a crowd, or do we need some kind of external manifestation for someone to realize, no, that man is a Jew? We should be able to be picked out in the crowd by saying, well, that person's got such good conduct, there's something special about that person. All right, with that, I want to bid everyone a good day, and thanks for joining. And I'm going to stop the recording. If there's anyone who has anything that they want to share, please feel